Before we begin, if you enjoy emotional stories about family, hidden truths, second chances, and unforgettable journeys of the heart, please take a moment to subscribe, like, and share this video. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories to life. Some people wait for a train that never comes. Gideon Hale waited for a woman who had been gone for 11 years. Every night at exactly 8:07 p.m., the same ritual began. Not 8:06, not 8:08, exactly 8:07. The old brass clock above the bar would click into place, and Gideon would leave his office without saying a word. Conversations would lower. Glasses would stop halfway to lips. Even newcomers learned quickly to stay quiet, because everyone in the harbor town knew what came next. I first heard the story from people who thought it was sad. Others thought it was strange. A few whispered that it was proof the most powerful man on the coast had finally lost his grip on reality. But nobody laughed where Gideon could hear. The restaurant sat at the edge of the water, where fishing boats rocked gently against weathered docks and salt air drifted through the windows every evening. It wasn't the largest restaurant in town. It wasn't even the most expensive. Yet every table was booked weeks in advance. Not because of the food, because it belonged to Gideon Hale, the man whose name carried enough weight to make problems disappear before they ever reached shore. At 8:07 p.m., he crossed the dining room wearing the same dark jacket he wore every evening. His silver-streaked hair was neatly combed back. His expression never changed. Calm, controlled, distant. He carried a single dinner plate in his hands, not because the staff couldn't do it, because nobody else was allowed to. He placed the plate carefully across from his own seat beside the window overlooking the harbor. Then he adjusted the silverware, straightened the napkin, filled a glass with water, and finally, he pulled out the empty chair as though someone might arrive at any second. Nobody ever did. The chair remained empty, just as it had every night for 11 years. Most people eventually learn how to live with loss. Gideon had built an entire life around refusing to. The plate was always different. Sometimes grilled salmon, sometimes roast chicken, sometimes clam chowder if the weather turned cold. Whatever would have been her favorite that night. Her. The woman nobody spoke about anymore. Evelyn Hale. His wife. The woman who disappeared without a trace 11 years ago. No goodbye. No note. No body. Nothing. The authorities searched for months. Friends searched longer. Eventually everyone accepted she was gone. Everyone except Gideon. He never remarried. Never removed her photographs. Never stopped setting the table. Every night he sat across from an empty chair and ate dinner in silence. Some evenings he would glance toward the door when it opened. Not obviously. Not enough for strangers to notice. But the staff noticed. They always noticed. Hope has a sound when it breaks. It sounds like a door opening and the wrong person walking through it. Tonight felt no different. Outside, fog rolled across the harbor in slow waves. Fishing lights blinked in the distance. The restaurant buzzed with quiet conversation as Gideon finished arranging the second place setting. Then the front door opened. Cold air swept inside. Nobody paid much attention at first. Just another customer escaping the evening chill. But within seconds, every head in the room began turning toward the entrance. A young woman stood there holding a worn canvas bag against her shoulder. Her dark coat was damp from the sea mist. Her eyes scanned the crowded restaurant with the uncertain look of someone who had never been there before. And before anyone could stop her, before anyone could even speak, she started walking directly toward the only empty chair in the room. The woman moved through the restaurant completely unaware of the silence following her. She looked tired in the way people do after carrying too many questions for too many years. Her dark brown hair was pulled back loosely, and a faded library card peeked out from the pocket of her canvas bag. She glanced around once, searching for an empty seat, and naturally chose the only one available. The chair beside the window. The chair nobody touched. The chair that had become part of the town's mythology. A server nearly dropped a tray. An elderly fisherman at the bar slowly removed his glasses. Somewhere near the kitchen someone whispered, "Oh no." The woman paused mid-step, finally noticing the strange reactions. "Is something wrong?" she asked. Nobody answered. Every eye shifted toward Gideon. He remained standing beside the table, motionless. For a moment he looked less like the powerful man everyone feared and more like someone who had forgotten how to breathe. The young woman followed their gaze and found herself staring at him. "I am sorry," she said with an awkward smile. "Was this seat reserved?" Gideon's eyes dropped to her wrist. A simple movement, barely noticeable. Yet something changed in his expression. His shoulders stiffened. His hand tightened around the back of his chair. There, just beneath the sleeve of her coat, was a small birthmark shaped like a crescent. Most people would never have noticed it. Gideon did. Because he had spent 11 years remembering every detail of someone else's hand. The room remained silent. The young woman looked increasingly uncomfortable. "I can move if somebody is coming." Gideon blinked once as if waking from a dream. Then he did something nobody expected. "No." His voice was calm, almost gentle. "You can stay." The entire restaurant seemed to exhale at once. Confusion spread across faces throughout the room. Gideon Hale never allowed anyone near that chair. Not family, not friends, not employees. Yet tonight he stepped aside. The woman slowly sat down. "Thank you." She removed her coat and placed her canvas bag beside her feet. Gideon lowered himself into his own chair across from her. The untouched plate remained between them. For several seconds neither spoke. Outside, harbor lights shimmered across the dark water. Inside, every customer pretended not to stare. Finally Gideon asked, "You are not from here?" "No." She smiled politely. "I arrived this morning." "Vacation?" Her smile faded slightly. "Not exactly." She hesitated. "I am looking for someone." Something about the answer made Gideon listen more carefully. "Family?" The woman nodded. "My mother." A shadow crossed her face. "Or at least, information about her." Gideon remained silent. She continued speaking, perhaps because she sensed he was actually listening. "I never knew her. She disappeared when I was very young. Nobody talks about her. Nobody seems to know anything." She laughed softly, though there was sadness beneath it. "At this point I am not even sure she wants to be found." Gideon's gaze drifted toward the empty plate. Then back to her. "People leave for many reasons." "Maybe." She looked out the window toward the harbor. "But sometimes I wonder if the truth is simply buried somewhere nobody bothered to look." Gideon felt something uncomfortable stir inside him. 11 years of unanswered questions. 11 years of searching through ghosts. 11 years of hoping tomorrow would explain yesterday. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. "Tessa Whitmore." The name meant nothing to him. Yet the feeling in his chest remained. Tessa reached into her bag and pulled out a worn photograph. "This is the only picture I have." Gideon's eyes fell to the image. And for the second time that night the world seemed to stop moving. Tessa slid the photograph across the table with the carefulness of someone handling the last remaining piece of a life she barely understood. The edges were worn soft from years of being carried from place to place. Gideon lowered his eyes to the image. At first, all he saw was a young woman standing near a white fence beneath a summer sky. Then his pulse slowed. The restaurant around him seemed to disappear. The woman in the photograph was not Evelyn. At least not exactly. But she looked enough like her to make old memories rise from places he had spent 11 years trying to bury. The same bright eyes. The same shape of her smile. The same way she tilted her head slightly toward the camera. Gideon felt the familiar ache settle into his chest. Tessa noticed the change immediately. "You know her." It was not a question. Gideon looked up. "No." The answer came too quickly. Too automatically. Tessa studied him for a moment. "That is the first time all day somebody has looked at this picture longer than 2 seconds." Her fingers rested lightly against the edge of the photograph. "The woman who gave this to me said my mother spent time in this town years ago." Gideon remained silent. "She said if I wanted answers I should come here." The harbor lights reflected in the restaurant windows behind her. Outside, fog continued drifting across the water. Inside, Gideon stared at the photograph again. Something about it bothered him. Not the woman. The background. His eyes narrowed. The fence looked familiar. Very familiar. "May I?" he asked. Tessa nodded. Gideon lifted the photograph. The image had faded with age, but certain details remained clear. A weathered fence. A flowering tree. A section of stone wall. He had seen that wall before. Hundreds of times. His stomach tightened, because it stood less than half a mile from where they sat now. Near the old Whitmore estate on the northern edge of town. A property abandoned for years. Tessa noticed his expression. What is it? Gideon placed the photograph back on the table. Where did you get this? From my grandmother. Her voice softened. She passed away 3 months ago. She looked down at the picture. She raised me after my mother disappeared. Gideon heard the word again. Disappeared. Not died. Not left. Disappeared. The same word people use when speaking about Evelyn. He glanced toward the empty plate still sitting untouched beside them. 11 years. 11 years of questions. 11 years of searching through reports, records, and rumors. Yet somehow a stranger had walked into his restaurant carrying a photograph connected to the same shadows he had chased for more than a decade. Felt impossible. What was your mother's name? Gideon asked quietly. Tessa hesitated. Charlotte Whitmore. The name meant nothing. No memory surfaced. No connection appeared. Yet something still felt wrong. Or perhaps right. He could not tell anymore. The old brass clock above the bar ticked softly through the silence. Tessa folded her hands together. Look, I know this sounds ridiculous. She gave a nervous laugh. I drove almost 600 miles because of one photograph and a story told by an old woman who was probably remembering things wrong. Her smile faded. But I need to know who. My mother was. Gideon understood that feeling better than anyone. The need to fill an empty space that never stopped hurting. The need to know why someone vanished. Why they never came back. Why they left behind only questions. He looked at the photograph one final time. Then toward the dark harbor outside. Finally he made a decision he had not expected to make. Tomorrow morning, he said, standing slowly from his chair. I will take you somewhere. Tessa blinked in surprise. Where? Gideon slipped the photograph into her hands and looked directly at her. To the place where that picture was taken. For the first time all evening, genuine hope appeared in Tessa's eyes. But as Gideon turned toward the window, a far more troubling thought entered his mind. Because there was only one person he knew who had ever spent time at the Whitmore estate 11 years ago. And that person had vanished without a trace. The next morning arrived wrapped in gray coastal fog. Tessa stood outside the restaurant clutching a paper cup of coffee she had barely touched. The harbor smelled of salt and weathered wood. Fishing boats drifted quietly against their moorings, and gulls circled overhead. She had spent most of the night awake in her motel room, staring at the photograph and replaying every word Gideon had said. Part of her expected him not to show up. Powerful men often made promises they did not keep. Yet at exactly 8 o'clock, a dark pickup truck rolled to the curb. Gideon stepped out wearing a navy jacket and carrying the same calm expression he seemed to wear like armor. Ready? He asked. Tessa nodded and climbed inside. The drive north took less than 15 minutes. The town slowly disappeared behind them as the road curved along the rocky shoreline. Weather-beaten houses gave way to dense pine trees. Eventually they turned onto a narrow lane half hidden by overgrown brush. A rusted iron gate stood open at the entrance. Beyond it sat an aging estate overlooking the ocean. Tessa immediately recognized the stone wall from the photograph. Her heart skipped. This is it. Gideon parked near the front steps. The house itself looked abandoned but not forgotten. Ivy climbed the exterior walls. Several windows were boarded. Others reflected the pale morning light. The place felt frozen in time. Tessa stepped out and slowly approached the stone wall from the photograph. Up close every detail matched. The same weathered stones. The same curve along the garden path. Even the old flowering tree remained, though it had grown much larger over the years. She was here, Tessa whispered. Gideon remained silent. His eyes scanned the property with an expression she could not read. It felt less like he was revisiting a place, and more like he was confronting a memory he had avoided for years. They walked through the neglected garden together. Weeds pushed through cracked pathways. Ocean wind stirred the branches overhead. Then Tessa stopped suddenly. Look! Near the base of the tree stood a small wooden bench. Most of the paint had peeled away. Yet carved into the armrest were two initials. Gideon's face changed instantly. He stepped closer. His fingers brushed the worn carving. For several seconds he said nothing. "Evelyn Hale," Tessa said quietly. Gideon nodded once. "She carved that herself." Tessa looked at him in surprise. "You are sure?" "I watched her do it." The answer came so softly it was almost carried away by the wind. Tessa realized this was the first personal thing he had shared about his missing wife. Not a fact from a report. Not a rumor. A memory. Real and painful. Then something else caught her attention. Beneath the bench, partially hidden by leaves, lay a rusted metal box. Tessa knelt immediately. "What is this?" Gideon frowned. "I have never seen it before." The lid resisted at first before finally giving way. Inside were several water-damaged papers, a faded ribbon, and a sealed envelope protected inside a plastic sleeve. Tessa carefully removed it. Her hands trembled as she turned it over. Written across the front in elegant handwriting were 5 words that made both of them freeze. "For the girl who returns." The ocean wind seemed to disappear. Even the distant cries of gulls faded into silence as Tessa stared at the envelope in her hands. "For the girl who returns." The words looked untouched by time. Gideon stood beside her, his eyes fixed on the handwriting. Every color had drained from his face. He knew those letters. He knew every curve of them. He had spent years staring at old birthday cards, grocery notes, and postcards just to remember the way Evelyn formed her words. "That is her handwriting," he said quietly. Tessa swallowed hard. Her fingers trembled as she looked from the envelope to Gideon. "You are sure?" He nodded once. There was no hesitation. No doubt. Just certainty. 11 years of certainty. Tessa carefully broke the seal. The paper inside had yellowed with age but remained intact. She unfolded it slowly. The first line stole the air from her lungs. "If you are reading this, then fate has been kinder than I ever expected." Tessa looked up. Gideon remained motionless. "Keep reading," he said. His voice sounded distant. Tessa lowered her eyes to the page. "There are things I cannot explain today. Not because I do not want to, but because some truths are dangerous when spoken too early. If you have found this letter, then enough time has passed. Enough healing. Enough waiting." Tessa continued reading, her voice barely above a whisper. "There is a little girl in this world who deserves answers. She deserves to know she was loved from the moment she arrived. She deserves to know none of this was her fault." Tessa froze. Her heart pounded against her ribs. The words seemed to echo through the abandoned garden. Gideon felt something cold settle deep inside him. "The little girl," Tessa said softly. Could she mean? Neither finished the sentence. The possibility hung between them. Tessa returned to the letter. "If she ever comes looking, tell her to visit the library. The old library. There she will find what I could never leave behind. There she will discover who I truly was." Tessa's eyes widened. "The library." Gideon frowned. "What library?" "The town library." She looked up. "That is why I came here. My grandmother mentioned an old library before she died." Gideon stared at the letter. Another piece. Another clue. Another thread connecting the past to the present. For 11 years every lead had ended in disappointment. Yet now answers seemed to be appearing faster than he could understand them. Tessa reached the bottom of the page. The final lines were shorter. Simpler. More personal. "Gideon, if you are standing beside her when she reads this, then thank you for keeping your promise." Gideon's breath caught. Tessa looked up sharply. "What promise?" But Gideon was no longer looking at her. His eyes remained fixed on the letter, on the name written in Evelyn's hand, because there had only ever been one promise. 11 years ago, on a quiet evening beside the harbor, he had promised Evelyn that no matter what happened, he would always protect the people she loved. The problem was that he had never known who those people were. Until now. Slowly, Tessa turned the page over. A small sketch appeared on the back. It showed a bookshelf. One shelf was marked with an X. Beneath it were 3 words. Third row. Blue journal. Gideon stared at the drawing. Tessa clutched the letter tighter. Somewhere inside the old library, another piece of Evelyn's story had been waiting all these years. And for the first time in over a decade, Both of them realized they were no longer searching for a ghost. They were following instructions. The town library sat 3 blocks from the harbor, tucked between a bakery and an old pharmacy that looked as though it had survived 100 winters. Tessa stood at the entrance holding Evelyn's letter, while Gideon stared up at the faded stone building. The place seemed ordinary, quiet, unremarkable. Yet somehow it had become the next destination in a trail that had waited more than a decade to be followed. The heavy wooden door creaked softly as they stepped inside. Warm air carried the scent of paper, dust, and polished wood. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, painting pale rectangles across the floor. For Tessa, the room felt strangely familiar. Not because she had been there before. Because libraries had always felt like home. Places where answers waited patiently for people willing to search long enough. The front desk stood empty. Only the distant sound of pages turning broke the silence. Gideon's eyes moved across the room. "Third row," he said. Tessa nodded. Together they walked. Deeper into the building. Shelves stretched toward the ceiling. Thousands of books sat untouched beneath decades of quiet routine. Then they found it. The third row. Exactly as Evelyn had drawn. Tessa's pulse quickened. She counted shelves carefully. 1, 2, 3. Halfway down stood a section of blue-covered journals. Most looked old, worn, forgotten. Yet one immediately caught her attention. It sat slightly forward compared to the others, as if someone had placed it there deliberately. Waiting. Tessa reached out slowly. Her fingers brushed the spine. Blue Journal. Volume 7. She pulled it free. Something slipped from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. Gideon bent down first. It was a photograph, much newer than the one from the estate. Tessa stared at it. A young woman stood smiling beside a bookshelf. She looked no older than 25. Her dark hair moved in the wind. A little girl stood beside her. The girl could not have been more than 4 years old. Tessa's breath caught. The child was wearing a yellow sweater. The same yellow sweater she had seen in her earliest childhood photographs. Her hands began to shake. "That is me." Gideon looked at her carefully. "You are certain?" "Yes." Her voice barely worked. "I still have that sweater." The room seemed smaller suddenly. Quieter. Tessa turned the photograph over. A date was written on the back. 24 years earlier. Beneath it appeared a single sentence. "Some stories begin before we know how to read them." Gideon stared at the handwriting. Evelyn again. Another message. Another breadcrumb. Tessa opened the journal carefully. The first page contained no title. Only a name. Charlotte Whitmore. Tessa froze. Her mother's name. For a moment she could not breathe. All her life Charlotte Whitmore had been little more than an empty space in conversations. A missing piece nobody could explain. Yet here her name sat in black ink on a page hidden inside a library. Waiting. Gideon slowly turned the next page. Several folded documents rested inside. Birth records. Newspaper clippings. Notes. Then one envelope slid free and landed gently on the table beside them. Unlike the first letter, this one carried a different message. Written clearly across the front were words that made both of them exchange a stunned look. "Open this only when Gideon Hale finally learns the truth." For several seconds neither of them touched the envelope. The library seemed impossibly quiet. Somewhere beyond the tall shelves, a clock ticked softly, marking the passage of time that suddenly felt very important. Gideon stared at the handwriting on the front. "Open this only when Gideon Hale finally learns the truth." The words unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Because after 11 years, he was no longer certain what truth meant. Every answer they uncovered seemed to create 2 new questions. Tessa carefully picked up the envelope. "Do you think she knew this day would come?" Gideon looked at the photograph lying beside the journal. The image of young Tessa in her yellow sweater felt impossible enough already. "I think she planned for it." Tessa nodded slowly. That felt true. Nothing they had found seemed accidental. The hidden box beneath the bench. The letter. The photograph. The journal. Someone had left a path. A trail designed to survive years of silence. She opened the envelope carefully. Inside rested several folded pages and a small brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. The ribbon immediately caught Gideon's attention. Evelyn had always loved that particular shade of blue. He remembered it wrapped around gifts, tied around flower stems, woven through countless ordinary moments that had once felt permanent. Tessa unfolded the first page and began reading. If you are holding this letter, then Gideon finally knows enough to hear the part of the story I could never tell him. First, understand this. Nobody betrayed anyone. Not Charlotte. Not Gideon. Not me. Tessa stopped reading. She looked up. Charlotte. Her mother's name. Gideon's chest tightened. Tessa continued. Years ago, Charlotte Whitmore came to me terrified and alone. She was carrying a burden she believed would destroy her future. She needed help. More importantly, she needed someone she could trust. I gave her both. Tessa felt her throat tighten. She had spent most of her life imagining her mother as a mystery, a ghost, a question mark. Yet here was evidence that someone had known her, cared about her, protected her. Gideon listened in silence. Tessa turned the page. What happened afterward was not a tragedy. It was a choice, a difficult one, a necessary one. Charlotte chose a life that required her to disappear from the world she once knew. But before she left, she asked one thing of me. She asked me to make sure her daughter would one day know she was loved. Tessa lowered the paper. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. Not because every question had been answered. Because for the first time in 29 years, she had proof that her mother had thought about her at all. Gideon watched quietly. He understood what it meant when a single sentence could heal a wound that had existed for decades. Then Tessa noticed something written near the bottom of the page. Her eyes widened. Gideon. His gaze lifted. What? She handed him the letter. A final note had been added beneath the signature. The brass key belongs to locker 17 at Harbor Station. Everything you are searching for is there. Gideon stared at the words. Harbor Station sat on the edge of town beside the old ferry terminal. Most of its storage lockers had not been opened in years. Tessa looked down at the small brass key resting in her palm. It felt surprisingly heavy, as though it carried more than metal, as though it carried 11 years of waiting. Gideon slowly closed the letter. For the first time since Evelyn disappeared, he felt something unfamiliar replacing the weight he had carried for so long. Not certainty, not peace, hope, and somehow that frightened him more than anything else. Harbor Station looked exactly the way forgotten places always do. The paint had faded. The benches sat empty. Salt from the ocean clung to every surface. Yet as Gideon and Tessa stepped through the front entrance that afternoon, neither of them noticed the building itself. Their attention remained fixed on the small brass key resting in Tessa's hand. Locker 17 waited at the far end of a narrow hallway. The numbers on the metal doors had begun to peel with age. Some lockers hung open. Others looked untouched for years. Number 17 stood closed. Silent. Waiting. Tessa stopped in front of it and took a slow breath. You want to do it? Gideon asked. She looked at him. Then at the key. No. Her voice trembled slightly. I think you should. Gideon hesitated before accepting the key. The metal felt cool against his palm. For 11 years he had searched for answers. Now one of them sat behind a thin steel door. His hand shook only once as he inserted the key into the lock. The mechanism clicked immediately. No resistance. No hesitation. Almost as if it had been expecting him. He opened the door. Both of them stared inside. The locker contained only 3 things. A canvas duffel bag, a sealed manila envelope, and a small wooden box. Nothing more. Nothing less. Tessa slowly lifted the envelope first. Written across the front in familiar handwriting were 6 simple words. Open this before anything else. Gideon closed his eyes briefly. Even now Evelyn seemed to be guiding every step. Tessa opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the letter inside. The paper crackled softly. If you found this, then you are closer to the truth than either of us ever expected. First, understand something important. I was never lost. Tessa stopped reading. Gideon felt his heart stumble. The words echoed through the empty station. I was never lost. He stared at the page. 11 years. 11 years spent believing something terrible had happened. 11 years spent blaming himself. Tessa continued reading. I left because I chose to leave. Not because I stopped loving anyone. Not because I was afraid. I left because someone needed me more than I needed my old life. Tears filled Gideon's eyes before he realized it. The sentence hurt in a way he could not explain. Not because it was cruel. 'Cause it sounded exactly like Evelyn. She had always placed other people before herself. Always. Tessa turned the page. Charlotte could not do it alone. The future depended on keeping certain promises. I made one of those promises willingly. If you are reading this today, then it means the promise succeeded. Tessa lowered the letter slowly. Charlotte. Gideon nodded. The name no longer felt like a coincidence. Felt like the center of everything. Then Tessa reached for the wooden box. Unlike the envelope, it carried no message. No instructions. Only a small brass clasp. She opened it carefully. Inside rested dozens of photographs. Some showed Charlotte. Others showed a little girl growing up year after year. Birthday cakes. School pictures. Library visits. Summer afternoons near the ocean. Tessa covered her mouth. Every photograph showed her. Someone had been watching from a distance. Someone had known where she was. Someone had cared enough to preserve moments she never knew existed. Then Gideon noticed one final item hidden beneath the photographs. A folded document. He pulled it free. The paper looked newer than everything else. Across the top appeared a date. 2 years ago. And beneath it sat a signature that caused both of them to freeze. Evelyn Hale. For a long moment neither of them moved. The station seemed suspended outside of time. Gideon stared at the signature as though looking at something impossible. 2 years ago. Not 11. Not 10. 2. The number echoed through his mind. Evelyn had been alive 2 years ago. She had written her name. She had left this document knowing someone would eventually find it. Tessa slowly lowered herself onto a nearby bench. Her hands felt unsteady. She was alive. Gideon nodded once. It was all he could manage. Every belief he had carried for more than a decade suddenly felt fragile. The grief. The guilt. The endless questions. None of them fit the story he had been telling himself. Tessa looked at the document. Open it. Gideon carefully unfolded the pages. Unlike the previous letters, this was not addressed to a stranger, nor to the girl who might return. It was addressed directly to him. Dear Gideon. The words alone nearly stopped his heart. He had imagined hearing from Evelyn thousands of times. In dreams. In memories. In moments when the ocean fog rolled across the harbor and made the world feel uncertain. But nothing prepared him for seeing her words again. He forced himself to continue reading. If you are reading this, then you finally know I chose to leave. I need you to understand. Something that may take time to accept. Leaving you was the hardest decision I ever made. Tessa remained silent as Gideon read. His eyes moved slowly across the page. I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. But there are different kinds of promises in life. Some are made to the people we love. Others are made to the people who need us. Sometimes those promises pull us in opposite directions. Gideon's chest tightened. He remembered Evelyn exactly that way. She could never walk away from someone in need. It was one of the reasons he loved her. And one of the reasons she had left. He continued. Charlotte needed protection. Her daughter needed a future. The truth is simple, Gideon. I did not disappear to escape my life. I disappeared to preserve someone else's. Tessa closed her eyes. Tears slipped quietly down her cheeks. For the first time, her mother's story no longer felt like abandonment. Felt like sacrifice. Gideon turned the page. The final section was shorter. More personal. If you have found Tessa, then everything happened the way I hoped it would. Tell her I watched from a distance whenever I could. Tell her every birthday mattered. Tell her every photograph was taken with love. And tell her her mother never forgot her for even a moment. Tessa pressed a hand against her mouth. Years of wondering seemed to collapse into that single sentence. Her mother had remembered. She had cared. She had loved her. Gideon reached the bottom of the document. There, beneath Evelyn's signature, another note appeared. One final instruction. If you want the last answer, go to Seabrook Point. Bring the pocket watch. Come at sunset. Gideon froze. The pocket watch. The cracked silver watch he carried every day. The one Evelyn had given him shortly after they married. Nobody else should have known about it. Tessa looked up. What does that mean? Gideon slowly reached into his jacket pocket and removed the watch. The cracked glass caught the afternoon light. For the first time in 11 years, it felt less like a reminder of loss and more like a key. Somewhere beyond the harbor, beyond the years of silence, Evelyn had left one final piece of herself waiting to be found. Seabrook Point sat at the far edge of the coastline where the cliffs met the Atlantic in a sweep of gray stone and endless horizon. Gideon arrived just before sunset with Tessa beside him. The sky glowed amber and gold, the last light of day spilling across the water like molten glass. For years he had driven past this place without stopping. Now every step felt significant. The pocket watch rested heavily in his hand. Tessa glanced toward the ocean. Do you think she was ever here? Gideon looked across the cliffs. I know she was. The certainty surprised even him. Something about this place felt familiar. Not because he remembered it clearly, because it carried the faint echo of a memory he had never fully understood. The wind lifted Tessa's hair as they followed a narrow path toward an old observation platform overlooking the sea. Weather and time had worn the wooden boards smooth. Most visitors ignored it now. There were newer viewpoints farther south. More accessible. More modern. Yet Evelyn had chosen this place for a reason. As they stepped onto the platform, the setting sun cast long shadows across the planks. Gideon's eyes immediately found something carved into the railing. A symbol. Small. Easy to miss. A circle surrounding an anchor. Tessa touched it gently. Have you seen this before? Gideon nodded slowly. On the back of one of Evelyn's notebooks. His pulse quickened. The symbol had always meant something to her. He just never knew what. Then he noticed a narrow metal plate built into the railing itself, almost hidden beneath years of salt and weather. In the center was a keyhole. Tessa stared. The key. Gideon reached into his pocket. The brass key from Harbor Station fit perfectly. For a moment neither moved. Then he turned it. A soft click echoed through the platform. A hidden compartment opened beneath the railing. Inside rested a single object. A leather journal wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Protected from time. Protected from the sea. Protected for someone to find. Tessa carefully lifted it free. The cover bore no title. Only a date. 11 years ago. Gideon's breath caught. This was it. The beginning. The journal opened easily. The first page contained only one sentence written in Evelyn's familiar hand. Some truths cannot be spoken until the people involved are ready to hear them. Tessa turned the next page. There were entries spanning months. Details about Charlotte. Notes about a little girl. Thoughts about difficult choices. And then, halfway through the journal, Gideon saw his own name. The words beneath it stopped him cold. Today I finally told Charlotte the truth. Gideon would never forgive himself if he knew. Tessa looked up immediately. What truth? Gideon stared at the page. For years he had blamed himself for losing Evelyn. But now another possibility emerged. What if the greatest secret had never been about Evelyn at all? Tessa continued reading. The final entry ended abruptly. No explanation. No conclusion. Only a single sentence written larger than all the others. If Tessa ever finds this journal, tell her to look inside the watch. Gideon's eyes widened. Slowly, almost afraid to breathe, he looked down at the cracked silver pocket watch resting in his hand. For 11 years he had carried it every day. Yet suddenly he realized he had never once wondered why Evelyn had given it to him in the first place. The sun had nearly disappeared beyond the horizon when Gideon turned the pocket watch over in his hands. For years it had been nothing more than a habit. Every morning it went into his jacket pocket. Every evening it rested beside his bed. He had carried it through seasons, losses, and endless unanswered questions. Yet now it felt different. Tessa moved closer. The wind coming off the ocean had grown colder, but neither seemed to notice. Their attention remained fixed on the watch. Gideon studied the cracked glass carefully. Then his thumb paused along the edge of the case. There is something here. Tessa leaned forward. Hidden beneath years of wear was a tiny notch carved into the metal frame. Small enough to escape notice. Large enough to suggest purpose. Gideon pressed it gently. Nothing happened. He tried again. This time a soft click echoed inside the watch. The back panel loosened slightly. Both of them froze. Slowly Gideon opened it. Behind the clockwork mechanism, sat a hidden compartment no larger than a postage stamp. Inside was a folded piece of paper. Tessa let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Gideon carefully removed it. The paper looked fragile with age. The edges had yellowed. Yet the handwriting remained clear. Evelyn's handwriting. He unfolded it slowly. Only a few sentences appeared on the page. Sometimes the truth hides inside the thing we carry every day. If you have opened this, then you are finally ready. Gideon's heart pounded. He continued reading. Tessa is not who she believes she is. Neither was Charlotte. For a moment the words made no sense. Tessa stared at the note. What does that mean? Gideon read further. Charlotte was never my friend. She was my sister. Silence swallowed the world around them. Even the crashing waves below seemed distant. Tessa blinked several times. Her expression emptied completely. Your sister. Gideon whispered. The final lines explained everything. Charlotte changed her name years before Tessa was born. She disappeared to protect her daughter from a family conflict she never created. I helped her because she was my sister. I stayed away because she asked me to. Tessa's hands trembled. Every assumption she had carried throughout her life began to shift. Charlotte Whitmore.
Evelyn Hale.
Sisters. Family. Connected all along. Gideon looked at her. For the first time he noticed details he had overlooked before. The shape of her smile. The way she tilted her head while thinking. Small pieces of Evelyn hidden inside another generation. Tessa swallowed hard. If Charlotte was her sister. Her voice cracked. Then what does that make me? Gideon lowered his eyes to the final sentence on the page. The one sentence Evelyn had saved for last. Tell Tessa she was never searching for strangers. She was searching for family. Tessa closed her eyes. Tears slipped down her cheeks. Not from sadness. Not entirely. From the overwhelming realization that after 29 years of feeling disconnected from her own story, she finally knew where she belonged. Gideon folded the note carefully. The sunset had faded completely now. Evening settled across Seabrook Point. Yet for the first time in 11 years, the darkness did not feel empty. Then Tessa noticed something written on the reverse side of the paper. Tiny words. Almost hidden. Her eyes widened as she read them aloud. One last letter remains. Come home. Gideon felt his pulse quicken. Because he knew exactly which home Evelyn meant. The restaurant by the harbor. The place where an untouched chair had waited for 11 years. The drive back to the harbor felt different. The road was the same. The ocean was the same. Yet everything inside Gideon had changed. For 11 years he had lived inside a story built on loss. Now he was discovering that the story had never been what he believed. Beside him, Tessa sat quietly holding the folded note from the watch. Every few minutes she looked down at it again, as if afraid the words might disappear. Family. The word echoed through her thoughts. Not a mystery. Not a stranger. Family. By the time they reached the restaurant, darkness had settled over the town. The familiar lights glowed warmly through the windows. Customers filled the dining room. Conversations drifted through the air. Life continued exactly as it always had. Yet Gideon noticed something he had not noticed in years. The place felt alive. Not haunted. Not frozen in time. Alive. He pushed open the door and immediately saw it. The chair beside the window. The chair that had remained untouched for 11 years. Waiting. The sight stopped him for a moment. Tessa followed his gaze. Neither spoke. Then one of the longtime employees approached carrying a small wooden box. The older man looked nervous. Mr. Hale, he said softly. I almost forgot. Gideon frowned. Forgot what? The man set the box on the table. This arrived years ago. Gideon's expression sharpened. Years. The employee nodded. About 3 months after she left. Silence settled between them. Why am I seeing it now? The man looked embarrassed. Because she instructed me not to give it to you until someone sat in that chair. Gideon stared at him. The room seemed to tilt. Every customer disappeared from his awareness. Every sound faded. Only the wooden box remained. Waiting. Just as everything else had been. Waiting. Tessa slowly sat in the chair beside the window. For the first time nobody looked shocked. Nobody looked uncomfortable. It felt natural now. Almost as though the chair had finally found its purpose, Gideon lowered himself into the seat across from her. The box sat between them. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside rested a single envelope. Nothing more. No documents. No photographs. Just one final letter. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Gideon, it is time to stop waiting. His chest tightened immediately. He opened the envelope. The letter inside was shorter than all the others. Dear Gideon, if you are reading this, then you finally know enough to understand. I never wanted you to spend your life looking backward. I wanted you to keep living. The truth is that I was never the person who needed saving. You were. Tears blurred Gideon's vision. Across the table, Tessa remained silent. She knew this part belonged to him. He continued reading. The chair was never meant to stay empty forever. It was meant to remind you that love leaves room for other people. New people. Unexpected people. Family you have not met yet. Gideon's eyes drifted toward Tessa. The final paragraph waited below. When the day comes, remove the second plate. Open the chair to someone new. And forgive yourself for surviving. Beneath the signature sat one final sentence. The simplest of all. I already did. Some endings arrive like thunder. Others arrive quietly, disguised as ordinary moments. 3 weeks later, the harbor town woke beneath a clear blue sky. Fishing boats moved across calm water. Shop owners unlocked their doors. Life continued the way it always had. Yet something inside Gideon Hale had finally changed. At exactly 8:07 that evening, he walked across the restaurant carrying a dinner plate. The same ritual. The same time. The same window overlooking the harbor. Customers noticed immediately. Many had watched the ritual for years. Some had grown up with it. Others had traveled hundreds of miles just to see the mysterious man who refused to let go of the past. Silence gradually spread through the room as Gideon approached the table. Tessa sat nearby, organizing a stack of library donation forms. During the weeks following their discoveries, she had decided to stay in town. What began as a search for answers had become something else. Connection. A family she never knew existed. A future she had never expected. Gideon reached the table and carefully placed the dinner plate down. Then he looked at the second place setting. The untouched glass. The folded napkin. The empty chair. For 11 years these objects had represented grief, regret, waiting. Tonight they represented something different. Understanding. Slowly he picked up the second plate. The dining room became completely still. Some people exchanged confused glances. Others watched with tears already forming in their eyes. Gideon carried the plate toward the kitchen. No speech. No announcement. No explanation. Just a simple act. When he returned, only one place setting remained on the table. The chair stayed where it was. Open. Available. No longer reserved for a memory. He sat down quietly. Across the room Tessa smiled. Gideon returned the smile. Small. Genuine. Perhaps the first truly peaceful smile anyone had seen from him in years. Later that evening, after the last customers left, the two of them stepped outside onto the harbor dock. The ocean reflected thousands of stars. A cool breeze moved across the water. Tessa leaned against the railing. Do you think she knew? She asked softly. Gideon looked out at the horizon. Knew what? That all of this would happen. He thought about the letters, the journal, the photographs, the hidden messages scattered through time. Then he nodded. I think she hoped. Tessa smiled. Hope. It seemed like such a small word for something powerful enough to survive 11 years. Gideon reached into his pocket and removed the cracked silver watch. He studied it for a moment before placing it gently into Tessa's hand. She looked surprised. Are you sure? He nodded. It belongs with family. Tessa closed her fingers around it. The watch felt warm from years of being carried. Years of loyalty. Years of love. For a while neither spoke. They simply stood together listening to the waves below. Finally Gideon looked toward the restaurant windows glowing behind them. The chair near the window remained visible from the dock. Empty, but no longer lonely. And for the first time in 11 years, he understood what Evelyn had been trying to teach him all along. Love was never about holding on forever. Love was about leaving enough light behind for someone else to find their way home. The harbor remained quiet. The stars reflected across the water. And somewhere beyond memory, beyond regret, beyond all the years that had been lost, a promise had finally been kept. Thank you for spending this journey with us. If Gideon and Tessa's story touched your heart, please subscribe, like, and share this video with someone who believes in hope, family, and second chances. Every subscription helps this channel continue telling meaningful stories that remind us that love, kindness, and forgiveness can light the way home. See you in the next story.